traffic could be denied no longer. It demanded, yes, it demanded access to the little trickster. She was helpless to prevent it. All she could do was utter a tiny gasp of horror as she saw the highway open out before her and understood that this was no common intersection they stood at. Fuller heard the sound. "Doctor?" He looked up from his tinkering, and his face, washed with a blue light she could see from the corner of her eye, bore an expression of inquiry. "Did you say something?" he asked. She thought, with a fillip of her stomach, of how this was bound to end. The ether faces of the dead were quite clear in front of her. She could see the profundity of their suffering, and she could sympathize with their ache to be heard. She saw plainly that the highways that crossed at Tollington Place were not common thoroughfares. She was not staring at the happy, idling traffic of the ordinary dead. No, that house opened onto a route walked only by the victims and the perpetrators of violence, the men, the women, the children who had died enduring all the pains nerves had wit to muster, with their minds branded by the circumstances of their deaths. Eloquent beyond words, their eyes spoke their agonies, their ghost bodies still bearing the wounds that had killed them. She could also see, mingling freely with the innocents, their slaughterers and tormentors. These monsters, frenzied, mush-minded bloodletters, peeked through into the world. None such creatures, unspoken, forbidden miracles of our species, chattering and howling their Jabberwocky. Now the boy above her sensed them. She saw him turn a little in the silent room, knowing that the voices he heard were not fly voices. The complaints were not insect complaints. He was aware, suddenly, that he had lived in a tiny corner of the world, and that the rest of it, the third, fourth and fifth worlds, were pressing at his lying back, hungry and irrevocable. The sight of his panic was also a smell and a taste to her. Yes, she tasted him as she had always longed to, but it was not a kiss that married their senses. It was his growing panic. It filled her up. Her empathy was total. The fearful glance was hers as much as his. Their dry throats rasped the same small word. Please, that the child learns. Please, that wins care and gifts. Please, that even the dead, surely even the dead must know and obey. Please. Today there would be no such mercy given, she knew for certain. These ghosts had despaired on the highway a grieving age, bearing the wounds they had died with, and the insanities they had slaughtered with. They had endured his levity and insolence, his idiocies, the fabrications that had made a game of their ordeals. They wanted to speak the truth. Fuller was peering at her more closely, his face now swimming in a sea of pulsing orange light. She felt his hands on her skin. They tasted of vinegar. "Are you all right?" he said, his breath like iron. She shook her head. No, she was not all right. Nothing was right. The crack was gaping wider every second. Through it she could see another sky, the slate heavens that lured over the highway. It overwhelmed the mere reality of the house. "Please," she said, her eyes rolling up to the fading substance of the ceiling. Wider, wider. The brittle world she inhabited was stretched to breaking point. Suddenly it broke, like a dam, and the black waters poured through, inundating the room. Fuller knew something was amiss. It was in the colour of his aura, the sudden fear. But he didn't understand what was happening. She felt his spine ripple. She could see his brain whirl. "What's going on?" he said. The pathos of the inquiry made her want to laugh. Upstairs, the water jug in the writing room shattered. Fuller let her go and ran towards the door. It began to rattle and shake even as he approached it, as though all the inhabitants of hell were beating on the other side. The handle turned and turned and turned. The paint blistered. The key glowed red hot. Fuller looked back at the doctor, who was still fixed in that grotesque position, head back, eyes wide. He reached for the handle, but the door opened before he could touch it. The hallway beyond had disappeared altogether. Where the familiar interior had stood, the vista of the highway stretched to the horizon. The sight killed Fuller in a moment. Mary Florescu knew she was alone. No strength to take the above her, the marvellous boy, it could not her beautiful, cheating child, through his was writhing and screeching his heart as stopped. The dead set their vengeful hands overturned the order of his system. She knew their intention. His bowels failed. She could see it in their eyes. His limbs shook There was nothing new about it. As he sank to the floor, his face began to blister like the door in its tradition, and his corpse rattle like the handle. He was to be used to record their testaments. He was inert stuff already. He was to be their as fit for this indignity as wood or steel. The vessel for their autobiographies. Somewhere to the east, a book of blood. His soul joined the wounded highway. A book made of blood. On its route to the intersection where a moment previously she thought of the grimoires that had been made of dead human skin. She'd seen them, touched them. She thought of the tattoos she'd seen, freak show exhibits, some of them. Others just shirtless labourers in the street with a message to their mothers pricked across their backs. It was not unknown to write a book of blood, but on such skin, on such gleaming skin. Oh God, that was the crime. He screamed as the torturing needles of broken jug glass skipped against his flesh, ploughing it up. She felt his agonies as if they had been hers, and they were not so terrible. Yet he screamed and fought and poured obscenities out at his attackers. They took no notice. They swarmed around him, deaf to any plea or prayer, and worked on him with all the enthusiasm of creatures forced into silence for too long. Mary listened as his voice wearied with its complaints, and she fought against the weight of fear in her limbs. Somehow she felt she must get up to the room. It didn't matter what was beyond the door or on the stairs. He needed her, and that was enough. She stood up and felt her hair swirl up from her head, flailing like the snake hair of the Gorgon Medusa. Reality swam. There was scarcely a floor to be seen beneath her. The boards of the house were ghostwood, and beyond them a seething dark raged and yawned at her. She looked to the door, feeling all the time a lethargy that was so hard to fight off. Clearly they didn't want her up there. Maybe, she thought, they even fear me a little. The idea gave her resolution. Why else were they bothering to intimidate her, unless her very presence, having once opened this hole in the world, was now a threat to them? The blistered door was open. Beyond it, the reality of the house had succumbed completely to the howling chaos of the highway. She stepped through, concentrating on the way her feet still touched solid floor, even though her eyes could no longer see it. The sky above her was Prussian blue. The highway was wide and windy. The dead pressed on every side. She fought through them as through a crowd of living people, while their gawping, idiot faces looked at her and hated her invasion. The please was gone. Now she said nothing, just gritted her teeth and narrowed her eyes against the highway, kicking her feet forward to find the reality of the stairs that she knew were there. She tripped as she touched them, and a howl went up from the crowd. She couldn't tell if they were laughing at her clumsiness or sounding a warning at how far she had got. First step, second step, third step. Though she was torn at from every side, she was winning against the crowd. Ahead, she could see through the door of the room to where her little liar was sprawled, surrounded by his attackers. His briefs were around his ankles. The scene looked like a kind of rape. He screamed no longer, but his eyes were wild with terror and pain. At least he was still alive. The natural resilience of his young mind had half accepted the spectacle that had opened in front of him. Suddenly his head jerked around and he looked straight through the door at her. In this extremity he had dredged up a true talent, a skill that was a fraction of Mary's, but enough to make contact with her. Their eyes met. In a sea of blue darkness, surrounded on every side with a civilization they neither knew nor understood, their living hearts met and married. "I'm sorry," he said silently. It was infinitely pitiful. I'm sorry. He looked away, his gaze wrenched from hers. She was certain she must be almost at the top of the stairs, her feet still treading air as far as her eyes could tell, the faces of the travellers above, below, and on every side of her. But she could see, very faintly, the outline of the door, and the boards and beams of the room where Simon lay. He was one mass of blood now, from head to foot. She could see the marks, the hieroglyphics of agony on every inch of his torso, his face, his limbs. One moment he seemed to flash into a kind of focus, and she could see him in the empty room, with the sun through the window, and the shattered jug at his side. Then her concentration would falter, and instead she'd see the invisible world made visible, and he'd be hanging in the air while they wrote on him from every side, plucking out the hair on his head and body to clear the page, writing in his armpits, writing on his eyelids, writing on his genitals, in the crease of his buttocks, on the soles of his feet. Only the wounds were in common between the two sites. Whether she saw him beset with authors or alone in the room, he was bleeding and bleeding. She had reached the door now. Her trembling hand stretched to touch the solid reality of the handle, but even with all the concentration she could muster, it would not come clear. There was barely a ghost image for her to focus on, though it was sufficient. She grasped the handle, turned it, and flung the door of the writing room open. He was there, in front of her. No more than 2 or 3 yards of possessed air separated them. Their eyes met again, and an eloquent look, common to the living and the dead worlds, passed between them. There was compassion in that look, and love. The fictions fell away, the lies were dust. In place of the boy's manipulative smiles was a true sweetness, answered in her face. And the dead, fearful of this look, turned their heads away. Their faces tightened, as though the skin was being stretched over the bone, their flesh darkening to a bruise, their voices becoming wistful with the anticipation of defeat. She reached to touch him, no longer having to fight against the hordes of the dead. They were falling away from their quarry on every side, like dying flies dropping from a window. She touched him lightly on the face. The touch was a benediction. Tears filled his eyes and ran down his scarified cheek, mingling with the blood. The dead had no voices now, nor even mouths. They were lost along the highway, their malice damned. Plane by plane, the room began to re-establish itself. The floorboards became visible under his sobbing body, every nail, every stained plank. The windows came clearly into view, and outside the twilight street was echoing with the clamour of children. The highway had disappeared from living human sight entirely. Its travellers had turned their faces to the dark and gone away into oblivion, leaving only their signs and their talismans in the concrete world. On the middle landing of number 65, the smoking, blistered body of Reg Fuller was casually trodden by the travellers' feet as they passed over the intersection. At length, Fuller's own soul came by in the throng and glanced down at the flesh he had once occupied, before the crowd pressed him on towards his judgment. Upstairs, in the darkening room, Mary Florescu knelt beside the McNeil boy and stroked his blood-plastered head. She didn't want to leave the house for assistance until she was certain his tormentors would not come back. There was no sound now but the whine of a jet finding its way through the stratosphere to morning. Even the boy's breathing was hushed and regular. No nimbus of light surrounded him. Every sense was in place. Sight, sound, touch, touch. She touched him now as she had never previously dared, brushing her fingertips oh so lightly over his body, running her fingers across the raised skin like a blind woman reading Braille. There were minute words on every millimetre of his body, written in a multitude of hands. Even through the blood she could discern the meticulous way that the words had harrowed into him. She could even read, by the dimming light, an occasional phrase. It was proof beyond any doubt, and she wished, oh God, how she wished, that she had not come by it. And yet, after a lifetime of waiting, here it was, the revelation of life beyond flesh, written in flesh itself. The boy would survive, that was clear. Already the blood was drying and the myriad wounds healing. He was healthy and strong after all. There would be no fundamental physical damage. His beauty was gone forever, of course. From now on, he would be an object of curiosity at best, and at worst of repugnance and horror. But she would protect him, and he would learn, in time, how to know and trust her. Their hearts were inextricably tied together. And after a time, when the words on his body were scabs and scars, she would read him. She would trace, with infinite love and patience, the stories the dead had told on him. The tale on his abdomen, written in a fine, cursive style. The testimony in exquisite, elegant print that covered his face and scalp. The story on his back and on his shin, on his hands. She would read them all, report them all, every last syllable that glistened and seeped beneath her adoring fingers, so that the world would know the stories that the dead tell. He was a book of blood, and she his sole translator. As darkness fell, she left off her vigil and led him, naked, into the balmy night. Here then are the stories written on the book of blood. Read if it pleases you, and learn. They are a map of that dark highway that leads out of life towards unknown destinations. Few will have to take it. Most will go peacefully along lamplit streets, ushered out of living with prayers and caresses. But for a few, a chosen few, the horrors will come, skipping to fetch them off to the highway of the damned. So read and learn. It's best to be prepared for the worst after all, and wise to learn to walk